The commission will come to order, and good morning to everybody. The Chinese government has spent the past 35 years telling couples what their families must look like. 35 years of state-sponsored violence against women, including coerced abortions and involuntary sterilizations in the name of population control. 35 years of viewing children as excess baggage from the day they are conceived, particularly the girl child. 35 years of wasting precious human capital and potential, and 35 years of committing massive crimes against women and children, enabled by pro-abortion non-governmental organizations and the United Nations Population Fund, or the UNFPA. Despite the platitude and applause by some being heaped on China's announced two-child policy, the proposal doesn't change the basic structure of coercive population control, and it is not some major reversal of policy to be lauded. And this so-called reform isn't even a done deal yet. According to the world-famous demographer, Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt, who will testify today, the one-child policy may become a two-child policy, but the coercive population control apparatus remains unchanged. Dr. Eberstadt says, to be clear, and I quote him here, that shift has not yet taken place. To the contrary, just days after the October 29th announcement, China's National Health and Family Planning Commission, which oversees the population program, emphasized that the new norms were not yet, quote, valid, and described the two-child policy as a, quote, proposal, indicating furthermore that this proposal would have to be approved by Beijing's legislature next year before it might be eventually be enacted, close quote. That said, the two-child policy may allow for more births if enacted at some future date, but it does not remove the pernicious incentives given to local officials to pressure and force mothers to abort a child if the birth hasn't been approved by the state and is or the couple's third child. Chinese families are still not free to determine the size of their own families, nor does this policy erase the enormous physical and psychological damage imposed on women, done by 3.5 decades of highly coercive birth limitations. We should not be applauding China's policy. We should be insisting, however, that they abolish all birth limits forever. Chen Quanzhen, the famous Chinese legal advocate and human rights champion, calls China's population control policies genocide. He calls for an international tribunal to vigorously investigate these crimes against humanity. And Mr. Chen calls on the Obama administration to enforce existing U.S. law and bar Chinese officials associated with the policy from entry to the United States. I would note parenthetically that I wrote that law in the year 2000. The Admiral Nance Meg Donovan Foreign Relations Act, it was a provision of that law, and I wrote it. And the Obama administration has completely and utterly failed to enforce and implement its provisions. Today, we're sending another letter, and I've asked this at multiple hearings over the last several years, asking the President to just simply implement the law, which he has not done. And hopefully we'll get an answer back, at least giving a reason why they have chosen not to implement a human rights law. The Chinese government is not the only one culpable in this heinous crime against women and children. The UN Population Fund, as we know, helped fund birth restrictions, fund forced abortions, and a massive and coercive family planning bureaucracy. Several years ago, I had a face-to-face meeting in Beijing with Madame Peng Peiyong, the bureaucrat in charge of China's draconian population program. Madame Peng repeatedly told me that my concerns about coercion were unfounded and said the UNFPA was there, they were on the ground, and found no coercion whatsoever. Of course, that's a complete whitewash. The UNFPA has whitewashed China's crimes for decades and continues to do so today. On their website, the UNFPA justifies its history in China, saying that they were tasked by the Executive Committee to help China and had to engage with China as a sovereign nation. Since 1994, the UNFPA claims that their efforts have focused on getting China to adopt a rights-based approach to family planning, saying they oppose coercion, violence, forced abortion, and sterilization as a violation of basic human rights. Yet, there is absolutely no evidence that their efforts made one bit of difference in changing China's policy. And again, part of the answer to critics like myself and others has always been the UNFPA is here on the ground, and they give us a clean bill of health. The UNFPA, I would submit, is complicit in China's coercive population control policies. The United States, and others who help fund the UNFPA programs in China are also complicit. It is a dark and bloody stain that cannot be washed away. I would note again that the Kemp-Kasten law, current law, it'll be repeated again, even in the omnibus bill that will be adopted probably by the end of next week, continues the UNFPA ban via the Kemp-Kasten, which requires a due diligence effort by the administration, which they have not done, and they just send a check to New York without even going through the motions. I hope China will abolish all aspects of its horrific birth control policy as soon as possible, and it ought to be looking to compensate its victims. For me and many others opposed to this policy, it's a matter of justice and human rights. For the Chinese government, it is now becoming increasingly a matter of economic survival. China's government says it is instituting a two-child policy to stem the twin demographic time bombs of rapidly aging population and millions of men and women unable to find wives. But this new policy is unlikely to solve those problems. As The Economist has noted, by 2025, nearly 1 in 4 Chinese citizens will be over the age of 60. At the same time, China's working-age population has shrunk in each of the past 3 years. These factors are likely to hurt not only government balance sheets, but also economic growth in China. This should be a particular concern to the Chinese Communist Party, as economic growth is the primary source of their ill-begotten legitimacy. The minimal policy change announced in October will do little to address the 3 decades-plus decimation of the female population. Approximately 40 million women and girls, and I think the number is far higher, perhaps millions more, are missing from the population, a policy that can only be accurately described as gendercide, the extermination of the girl child in society simply because she happens to be a girl. The lack of girls has led to a dramatically skewed gender ratio. An estimated 30+ million, some say 40, will be unable to find wives in the coming decades. I mean, that is unbelievable, and that has become a magnet for human trafficking. The Chinese government should be concerned, as should China's neighbors, as to the consequences of this. It's a ticking time bomb. We now see more human trafficking and forced marriages and sexual slavery. NGOs working in Vietnam, Cambodia, Burma have all reported an increase in trafficking of women and girls into China in recent years. And even if China ends its birth restrictions, given its current demographics, this problem of the shortage of women in China will only get worse in the coming decade. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Pittenger, Commissioner, for any comments you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership in such a grave concern to each of us. I returned from China. I was there this fall, meeting with the leadership in Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen, business leaders and government leaders, and had formal and informal discussions regarding issues related to human rights, religious liberties, freedoms of conscience, and yes, the issues related to forced abortions. On one occasion, one of the leaders quietly lamented to me that they felt that this policy was horrific and should hopefully be changed in their culture. And they saw the impact that it had on women's lives and was a real dark stain upon their culture. So my hope and prayer is that that will take place. However, the Chinese government has shown blatant disregard for these basic human rights of their people. This thinly veiled offenses against freedom of the press, expression, religion, and speech, as well as their focused attacks on international entities and human rights advocates, paint a picture of stifling and oftentimes terrifying life for the Chinese people. China's population control policies are perhaps the most widely known offense. These policies are particularly egregious and are arguably the most systemically and heavily enforced in the world, with severe emotional and physical harm on women. China's national and provincial family planning laws and regulations stipulate if, when, and how often Chinese citizens may bear children. At the local level, enforcement of population control policies has led to reports of traumatic violations of individual rights, including forced abortions, sterilizations, involuntary implantation of birth control devices, and illegal children going unregistered. Last month, China announced that their one-child policy would become a two-child policy. While this change shows that the Chinese government recognizes the failure of its policy, it is frankly not enough. With a rapidly aging population, shrinking workforce, and a large cohort of young men who will be unable to establish families, China's continued adherence to its population control policies not only it violates international human rights standards, but goes against China's own interest. We must continue unwaveringly to take a firm stand in opposition to China's population control policies, use every reasonable resource available to facilitate their abolition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ted Lieu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Last month, I had the opportunity to go to Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tibet with Leader Pelosi and Codell. We raised issues of religious freedom, autonomy in Tibet, and human rights across China. It's been widely acknowledged that China's one-child policy has been a disaster. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses what they think of China's new policy, which also continues to restrict human freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lieu. Mr. Commissioner Holgren?
Don't have much of a comment other than this is such an important subject for us to be discussing, to figure out ways that we as members of Congress can highlight really the tragedy, the loss that has happened there, and the need for change of policy, real change in policy, not just talk. So looking forward to hearing from our witnesses. I yield back.
Thank you. The distinguished gentlelady from Missouri, Vicki Hartzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I'm just glad to be able to be a part today of this very important discussion, and hope that we'll be able to advocate and do something to help the women and the families of China be able to determine their own future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel, beginning with Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt, who is the Henry Wendt Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. A political economist and demographer by training, he is a senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asian Research and has served on the visiting committee at the Harvard School of Public Health, the Global Leadership Council, the World Economic Forum, and the President's Council on Bioethics. He has also served as a consultant to the World Bank, Department of State, U.S. Agency for International Development, and the Bureau of the Census. Ms. Reggie Littlejohn is founder and president of Women's Rights Without Borders, a broad-based international coalition that opposes forced abortion and sexual slavery in China. Ms. Littlejohn is an acclaimed expert on China's one-child policy, having testified 6 times before the U.S. Congress, 3 times before the European Parliament, and presented at the British, Irish, and Canadian parliaments as well. She has briefed officials at the White House, Department of State, UN, and the Vatican. Her Save a Girl campaign has saved more than 150 baby girls from sex-selective abortion or grinding poverty in China. Ms. Jennifer Lee lived in China for many years and is co-founder of China Life Alliance, a network of individuals, churches, and ministries who seek to protect the lives of millions in China who are threatened by abortion, infanticide, abandonment, and human trafficking. They do this by educating and mobilizing groups to rescue women and save children through their Safe House network, legal aid network, coerced abortion rescue teams, and in a variety of other ways. We'll then hear from Ms. Sarah Huang, who has personally rescued more than 80 Chinese women and children threatened by abortion, infanticide, and abandonment, and trafficking. Since 2013, international media has covered the efforts of Sarah, a humble pastor in China, who has been nicknamed the Mother Teresa of China, as she courageously assists vulnerable women who must hide their pregnancies to escape coercive abortions from Chinese family planning cadres. Sarah has been working closely behind the scenes with China Life Alliance and has been pivotal in assisting numerous Chinese families, including a number of widely reported forced abortion cases that have been leaked into the international media. Sarah Lee is currently pregnant with her 2nd child and now experiencing her own battle to save the life of her unborn child from a mandatory abortion. We will then hear from Mr. Stephen Mosier, who is president of the Population Research Institute and has worked tirelessly since 1979 to fight coercive population control programs. He's an internationally recognized authority on China and population issues. He served as director of the Asian Studies Center at the Claremont Institute from 86 to 95 and was appointed in 1991 to serve as commissioner of the U.S. Commission on Broadcasting to the PRC. Following a period of naval service in '79, he became the first American social scientist permitted to do research in China since the Communist Revolution. And I would note that it was Stephen Mosher who broke the story to the world and to Congress about what was going on, and his books and his writings brought the bright line of scrutiny to this infamous policy, and that was in the early 1980s. So I want to thank Dr. Mosher for that leadership. Dr. Eberstadt.
Mr. Chairman, members of Congress, distinguished co-panelists, and esteemed guests, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. With your permission, I'd like to ask that a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed I did on this same subject be added.
Without objection, so ordered.
On October 29th of this year, a shift from a one-child to a two-child norm was announced by the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party at the 5th plenum of the 18th Party Congress. In other words, the party signaled that it would be abandoning the one-child policy it had promulgated and would now be moving to allow all parents in China to have two children. To be clear, as the chairman has already indicated, that shift has not yet taken place. Suffice it to say that the particulars of the new two-child policy thus still remain to be seen. It's not too soon, however, to make a few basic points. First, the end of the one-child policy will not mean the end of coercive birth control in China. This is a critical fact that cannot be underscored sufficiently. The Chinese government is not retiring its enormous apparatus of involuntary population plan enforcement. Beijing is not relinquishing its claim that the state, rather than parents, should be the proper authority for deciding how many children China's families may have. Instead, it's the Chinese Communist Party, which is merely preparing to recalibrate the limit it will grant its subjects. By all indications, the sorts of ugly human rights violations that other witnesses will be describing here this morning, up to and including criminalizing out-of-quota pregnancies and forcibly compelling abortions against the will of the mother, will still be very much part and parcel of China's population policy agenda. Second, any two-child norm would necessarily and inescapably still expose parents who desire more than two children to coercive birth control. For China's population planners, there is no contradiction whatsoever between raising the permissible birth quota and deploying the power of the state against birth quota violators. Third, in addition to its obvious demographic focus, China's population program should be understood to serve more broadly as an instrument of population control in the more general sense of social control. And it's not a standalone policy in China in this regard. We must bear in mind contemporary China's hukou system of household registration and residence permits, the likes of which is only seen otherwise today in the DPRK in North Korea. At this writing, a distinct majority of the young men and women in China's big cities, thanks to this hukou program, are de facto illegal aliens in their own country, violating these established hukou rules. I can show you a little graphic of this on the slide over there. The blue and red are the non-hukou residents in big cities. The transparent is the legal residents in big cities. The hukou violators don't have rights to social services. They can't move their families with them. They're discriminated against in wages in the cities, and they'll always, always lose in any dispute with locals. It's Soweto with Chinese characteristics. One might think that the obvious solution to this problem would be to relax the hukou restrictions or to scrap them altogether. But despite considerable talk of hukou reform over the past 2 decades in Beijing, Chinese authorities have shown extreme reluctance to do away with the hukou system in practice. Given both the nature of Chinese rule and the traditions that predate it, we should not be surprised if authorities in Beijing prove similarly surprisingly attached to coercive population policy precisely because of the social control it affords the rulers over the ruled. Fourth, It is worth noting that some Chinese researchers and academics are already calling for more aggressive measures to stimulate population growth. Is it possible that Beijing might reverse course in the future and veer from antinatal to pronatal coercive birth control? Stephen Mosher is here this morning, and I don't want to steal any of Steve's thunder, but I'd be a plagiarist if I didn't quote him on what he's written about this. Steve has said, the same party officials who have been responsible for decades of forced abortions and sterilizations would presumably have no qualms over enforcing mandatory pregnancy on young women if they were ordered to do so. Finally, among the many unanswered questions concerning coercive birth control in China, the most important and perhaps also surprising is its ultimate demographic impact. Strange as this may sound, demographers and population specialists have yet to offer a plausible and methodologically defensible estimate of just how much this extraordinarily ambitious and ruthless adventure in social engineering has actually altered the size and composition of China's population. I've submitted some slides and some additional testimony on this matter. Let me just conclude by saying forcible birth control looks to be the Chinese government's preferred policy path for the indefinite future. What is incontestable is that this path guarantees systematic human rights abuse. Much less well understood is what impact forcible population control stands to exert on the demographic rhythms of Chinese society. Demographic specialists need to pay much more attention to this question than they have to date. Thank you.
Dr. Eberstadt, thank you so very much. Ms. Littlejohn.
Honorable members of the Commission, Representative Chris Smith, Mr. Pittenger, Mr. Liu, Mr. Holmgren, I'm grateful for this opportunity to testify here today as we discuss China's new two-child policy, which continues the massive crimes against women and children under the one-child policy. Xinhua News Agency reported on October 29th that China is moving from a one-child policy to a two-child policy and used the word that they were abandoning the one-child policy. That word is extremely misleading. The two-child policy will not end any of the human rights abuses that were caused by the one-child policy, including forced abortions, forced sterilizations, and as well as the sex-selective abortion of baby girls. Coercion and control remain at the core of the two-child policy, just as it was under the one-child policy. As Chen Guangchen succinctly tweeted, "There's nothing to be happy about. First, the CCP would kill any baby after one. Now they kill any baby after two." It appears, therefore, that China plans to maintain its iron grip over the wombs of women. The Chinese Communist Party will continue to intrude into the bedrooms and between the sheets of the people of China, requiring an arduous process to get a birth permit, a system of paid informants, and ultrasound checks to make sure that a woman's IUD is still in place. Women's Rights Without Frontiers has a network of field workers in one area of rural China, and I have been in communication with the head of that network over the weekend. I want to report to you from our network on the ground in China what the response is in rural China in our area to this two-child policy. And the response is that it's no big deal whatsoever, and it's not going to resolve the problems in the countryside of China. So, the main reason for this is because of the continued threat of forced sterilization. So that if a woman has a son, she's not likely then to get pregnant again because she has her son, and if she has a second child, she's going to be forcibly sterilized. These forced sterilizations not only ruin a woman's reproductive health, they ruin a woman's general health as well. So that, according to my network, a woman, before she's sterilized, women as well as men do hard labor on the farms. After they're sterilized, a woman can't even pump water out of the well. And this lasts forever. The woman is permanently disabled from doing hard farm labor, and this is a huge catastrophic event for her family and the villages. So especially a woman whose first child is a girl is going to feel that she has to hide her second pregnancy, because if it's a boy, she's going to be forcibly sterilized after giving birth. But even if it's another girl, she doesn't want the authorities to know about this, because number one, she'll be forcibly sterilized if she gives birth to this girl, or when she gives birth to the girl. And number two, she wants to preserve the ability to have a boy. So these second daughters are either aborted, that's what happens a lot of the time, or abandoned, or hidden so that they have no hukou. So that the woman can then give birth, have a third pregnancy if she has two girls. Hukou in our area is only given to a second child after the mother has submitted to sterilization. So the forced abortions are continuing under the new two-child policy, because women who are pregnant now, who have gotten pregnant before the new two-child policy takes effect, if it does in fact take effect, are still considered to be illegally pregnant, and we're going to be hearing from Sarah Huang, who's in precisely that situation. According to our network, if a woman is caught illegally pregnant and cannot pay the fine, she is still going to be forcibly aborted, as was the case under the one-child policy. According to the president of a local hospital and a family planning official contacted by our network, if a woman runs away because she knows that she's illegally pregnant and she is caught, she absolutely will be forcibly aborted. She will not be given any opportunity to pay a fine. In our village, whether or not a woman is actually forcibly aborted or given the opportunity to pay the fine depends on a couple of factors. One is, how powerful is the woman? Does she have any resources? Poor women, women whose families are not connected to the Chinese Communist Party, are much more likely to be forcibly aborted than a woman of means or a woman whose family members work for the party. And similarly, the enforcement of the one-child policy is extremely arbitrary, and it really depends on who the family planning official is that shows up at your door. There are people who will be merciful and give the woman an opportunity to pay a fine, and there are people who are merciless and will not give the opportunity to pay a fine. Women in our villages have resorted to desperate measures to avoid a forced abortion when faced with an illegal pregnancy.
Pardon me, Ms. Littlejohn?
Yes.
There are 7 votes on the floor. We're at 0 right now, so for the first one, we're at least 30 seconds to go. We take a brief recess, and I apologize to our witnesses and to people who have come out, but we'll resume as soon as those votes are over. If one of the or two of our senators, because we understand a few are on their way, they will resume the hearing, and then we'll just we'll pick it up when we.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Fast life.
Diamond Liu.
Oh, yes, hi. Nice to see you, Diamond.
It's good to see you.
Yeah. How's life going?
Life is good.
Good.
Well, recently I wrote a paper on the instrument power of the Chinese Communist
Sorry. Okay, so you want me to continue now?
You know, we're going to keep moving forward, yeah. So is
Okay.
I'll chair here until the House members come back. So I'm came over from the Senate side here. So
Thank you so much.
absolutely. So I'm Senator Steve Daines from the state of Montana. And
It's a pleasure to meet you,
no,
Senator Daines.
very glad to have you here. I lived in China for 5 years, working for Procter & Gamble back in the 90s. So had 2 children born in Hong Kong and have a lot of interest in this subject and some experience of being on the ground there as well. So anyway, Ms. Lojan, continue.
Okay, so what I was talking about is Women's Rights Without Frontiers has a network of field workers in rural China, and I was talking about the reactions of women in rural China to the new two-child policy, and I was about to tell a story about how women get around the forced abortion that is still required under the two-child policy. So I understand that the following situation is common in our area. Aibao, which is not her real name, is a second daughter. And when her mother found out that she was pregnant, she went into hiding because she did not have a birth permit. However, she was discovered. And so when the family planning police tried to forcibly abort her, what she did is she found another woman who was also illegally pregnant, but who was an unwed mother. And unwed mothers are never given the opportunity to even pay a fine or anything. So she paid that woman 2,000 yuan to have an abortion in her name so that she could then use that woman's abortion certificate and hand it to the family planning police. So once they had those that abortion certificate, she went into hiding and was able to give birth to her second daughter. These are the kinds of desperate measures that people will take to avoid the forced abortion under the one-child policy. Also, instituting a two-child policy will not end gendercide in China. As people in this hearing no doubt know, there are approximately 37 million more men living in China than women, and that the birth ratio of men and women, or boys and girls, is about 117 boys born for every 100 girls born. This is not going to improve, in my opinion, under the two-child policy because of the specter of forced sterilization. Many women whose first child is a boy may choose not to bear a second child because of the expense of having children in China and because of that in our area, you cannot get hukou for the second child without a sterilization, and these women do not want to be sterilized because it breaks their health. Similarly, women whose first child is a girl are not going to are going to hide the second pregnancy because if they give birth to another girl, they want to have the opportunity to have another pregnancy, to have a boy, and also they don't want to be sterilized because if you have a second girl, you will also be sterilized, or else she will not get hukou. In addition, there's a technology that is potentially dangerous to girls that has found its way to China. There's recently been discovered that cell-free DNA can be found in the blood of a pregnant mother. And so they've developed this test called non-invasive prenatal testing, which is ominously, the ominous acronym for this is NIPT. And I couldn't help but think of nipped in the bud because this is a new way to detect chromosomal abnormalities, and it can be used even as early as 7 weeks, but people already are using it to determine the gender of a fetus. And I just worry that when brutal son preference meets with non-invasive blood test technology, many, many millions of girls are going to be aborted. The hukou abuses continue. Our network reports that in our area, unless a woman is sterilized, her second child will be denied hukou. And without hukou, children are denied access to health care, education, and other public benefits. There's been recent talk about registering 13 million people who do not have hukou. The motive here appears to be an attempt to make the population look less unbalanced. But Women's Rights Without Frontiers demands the unconditional end of the hukou system as being inhumane. Eliminating hukou by itself, however, will not end gendercide unless it is accompanied by the elimination of the forced sterilization that still occurs after the second pregnancy. Women will not register a second daughter for hukou if by doing so they're going to be giving up the chance to have a son. So some have publicly wondered what will happen to the army of family planning officials now that China has, quote unquote, abolished the one-child policy. This question in itself is overly optimistic. The two-child policy remains just as coercive as the former one-child policy. This infrastructure of coercion can be turned to crush dissent in any area. There is growing unrest inside China. Internal Chinese law enforcement data on so-called mass incidents indicates that China has seen a sustained rapid increase in these incidents from 8,700 in 2003 to nearly 60,000, 8,700 in 1993 to nearly 60,000 in 2003 to more than 120,000 in 2008. Meanwhile, there are as many as 1 million family planning officials in China. This 1 million army, if it were a standing army, would tie with North Korea as being the 6th largest standing army in the world. Given the unrest that's happening in China, does the army of family planning officials, do the Chinese Communist Party regard this as being necessary to keep down social unrest in China? Therefore, I believe that the Chinese Communist Party will never relinquish coercive population control. As fully explained in my congressional testimony of April 30th of this year, I believe that the Chinese Communist Party might slowly open up the one-child policy, but they will never abandon coercive birth control because, number one, it enables them to maintain their grip on power through terror. It is social control masquerading as population control. Number two, coercive population control is a lucrative profit center, bringing in as much as $314 billion in fines since its inception. Number three, it provides an infrastructure of coercion that can be turned to crush dissent of any sort. And number four, it ruptures relationships of trust so that people cannot organize, because if you don't know who you can trust, you cannot organize for democracy. Sending out the message that China has abandoned its one-child policy is detrimental to sincere efforts to stop forced abortion and genocide in China, because this message implies that the one-child policy is no longer a problem. In a world laden with compassion fatigue, people are relieved to cross China's one-child policy off their list of things to worry about, but we must not do that. Let us not abandon the women and the babies of China who continue to face forced abortion and forced sterilization, and the girls who continue to face sex-selective abortion and abandonment under the new two-child policy. The one-child policy does not need to be modified. It needs to be abolished. Thank you.
I think we're going to go next to Ms. Huang, actually. Ms. Huang, you might have to turn on your microphone.
尊敬的史密斯议员、卢比奥参议员、CECC 的先生们和女士们，以及各位尊贵的来宾，你们好。
Greetings, Honorable Chairman Congressman Smith, Co-Chairman Senator Rubio, members of the CECC, and distinguished guests.
今天我很荣幸有这一次机会来分享我本人惨痛的一些经历。
I am honored to have this opportunity to share my painful story.
并对这个国家深怀感激，因为美国在全世界倡导推动人权和国际社会合作，规训律是中国的国家遵守国际法，尊重普世价值以及保护人的尊严。
And I'm grateful for this country, which has provided the necessary leadership in promoting human rights throughout the world, including working with the international community to persuade countries like China to adhere to international law and universal values on the protection of human dignity.
自建国以来，美国有着丰富的历史经验，引领维护在独立宣言中确立人权的保障。
Since the beginning of this nation, the United States has had a rich history of leading the way in protecting human rights from the Declaration of Independence.
其中宣称人人被造平等，操务者赋予他们若干不可剥夺的权利，其中包括 其中包括生命权、自由权和追求幸福的权利。
which states that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
奥巴马总统甚至提到有责任为不能发声的人代言的重要性。
President Obama has even spoken on the importance of answering the responsibility of to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves.
为他人代言是我的核心准则之一。也是为什么我和我的丈夫愿意继续向那些无助的人和不能发声的人敞开我们的心和我们的家。
Speaking up for others is one of my core values and one of many reasons why my husband and I continually open our hearts and home to the vulnerable and the voiceless.
在美国，你可以选择为无辜的人大声的呼吁，也可以选择沉默。但是在我的国家，妇女们被告知她们不可以为她们的身体或是为子宫的胎儿呼吁。
In America, you have a choice. You can choose to speak up for the innocent or to stay silent. In my country, women are told they cannot speak up for their own bodies or for the children in the womb.
在中国，这场征战不是关于反对堕胎，或是堕胎应合法化。强制性或威迫性的堕胎是一场持续的折磨。
In China, this struggle is not about pro-life or pro-choice, but about enduring torture or enduring strict punishment for disobeying.
或者说是对不服从者的持续的严厉惩罚。因为这个缘故，所以我的电话才响个不停。有那么一些勇敢的妇女，为了保住他们的孩子，勇敢挑战这个政策。
It is because of this that my phones ring constantly by the very few women that are courageous enough to defy the policy to keep the child.
那些是和我素不相识的妇女，经常打电话给我，找我说我怀孕了，我走投无路。有人告诉我说，你能帮助我保住我的孩子吗？当然，我总是想方设法的帮助他们所有的人。
Those strangers frequently call me and say, I'm pregnant and have no options. I was told you can help me to keep my child. Of course, I try to help them all.
我曾经因为反对臭名昭彰的一胎化政策，忙碌于很多的事情。不幸的是，二胎化政策并没有让我轻松。
Unfortunately, I am just as busy now with the Chinese government's newly announced two-child policy as I was with the infamous one-child policy.
虽然这里有一位专家今天会提供更多的细节，请允许我简单分享一下数据。
Although there is an expert here today that will share in more detail, please allow me to share briefly about the statistics.
中国政府的数据报告说，每年实施1300万的堕胎手术，每天平均有35000个堕胎手术。
The Chinese government data reports that 13 million abortions are performed each year for an average rate of 35,000 abortions per day.
我个人相信实际的数字应该比这个要高得多。
I personally believe the number is much higher.
因为官方数据只包括了医院提供的数字，大部分的胎儿是在未经过注册的黑诊所和家里完成的。
Because these official statistics only include hospitals that report their figures and most abortions occur in unauthorized black clinics or at home.
我们认为真实的数字高得多的原因之一是根据中国文化基于羞耻之心的特点。
One reason why we think the number of abortions is considerably higher is because China is a shame-based culture.
中国家庭不愿意去官方的诊所堕胎，丢人现眼，在那里他们会被要求登记。
Chinese families do not want the attention of going to an official abortion clinic where they are required to register or show their ID.
因此，大多数中国妇女选择去未经注册登记的诊所，所谓的黑诊所，不具名，接受流产手术。
As a result, most Chinese women who receive abortions choose to do it anonymously at the unregistered clinics known as the black clinics.
下面我简单的介绍一下关于我怀孕的故事。
Now I'm going to briefly share my pregnancy story.
我丈夫和我想要第二个孩子已经很久了，所以发现我怀孕后，我们自然是一件很开心的事情。
My husband and I have wanted a second child for many years, so after finding out we were pregnant, we were of course very happy.
特别是当听到一胎化政策被废除的时候，我们以为我们不会有任何的麻烦，甚至我们在报道里面听到说，中国所有的家庭都可以有第二个孩子。
Especially when we heard that the one-child policy has been cancelled, abolished, and thought that our problems had been solved. We even heard in the news that even everyone in China can now have a second child.
虽然我们有怀疑，我们还是非常的欣喜，因为这意味着想要孩子的家庭可以有更多的孩子。
Although we were skeptical, our immediate reaction was to rejoice, as this would mean a lot more babies born to families that wanted to keep them.
我以为我们的问题就会解决了。
We thought all our problems were solved.
直到就是我丈夫所在的政府单位通知他，我们必须出具那个孕检证明，否则我必须堕胎。
Until we heard from my husband's employer, the Chinese government, that abortion would be mandatory until we present the proof that that I had this IUD installed.
因此呢，就是我丈夫就受到了威胁，因为如果现在我去做孕检证明的话，那么肯定我会被强制性堕胎。
So my husband was threatened that if I failed to present this proof that I had the IUD installed, and I would be subject to forced abortion.
据我现在的经历和观察来看的话，首先关于新出台的二胎化政策，虽然好过一胎化政策，但现在许多可以对每对夫妻都有第二个孩子是一个是不可信的。为什么呢？因为就是他只是说了 CCTV 在告诉我们，世界所有的人都可以有第二个孩子，但是他还没有落实到真正就是说可以实施的地步。
According to my experience and observation, that this newly announced two-child policy is not applicable to every family and every couple, because this policy has not been in complete implemented yet.
它不适用于我们的情况，以及也不适用于那些目前在中国被逼迫躲藏起来的家庭。
For example, it does not apply to my case, nor to those families who are currently in hiding in China.
二胎化政策并不完全的坏，虽然不是所有的家庭，但是大多数家庭可以复活的条件，可以保留他们的第二个孩子。但是二胎化政策产生的改变明显的不够。
The newly announced two-child policy is not completely bad. Majority, but not all, family will meet the criteria and be allowed to keep the second child. However, clearly China's change to a two-child policy is not enough.
那些理想要孩子的家庭，仍然可能会遭受到强制性的性绝育措施，或者是人工流产，就是等于肉体上的折磨。
Chinese families who attempt to have two children could still be subject to coercive and intrusive forms of contraception and forced abortions, which amount to torture. 另外一个常见的错误是，国家计划生育委员已经解体，因此相关的腐败行为以及其不受司法处罚的现象一并清除，那并不是事实。 Another common myth is that China's brutal family planning bureau has been dissolved, thus removing all of its corrupt practices and acts of impunity. It's not true.
这个机构只是换了个名称而已。
It has simply been renamed.
我并不否认可能会有一些积极的改变，事实上是为其效力的同一批党员干部，现在为国家卫生和计划生育委员会工作。
Although I do not doubt there may be some positive changes, the truth is that the same party members that worked for the Family Planning Bureau are now employed by the National Health and Family Planning Bureau.
这个机构实行严格的堕胎配置，从而促使计生官员为保住饭碗，继续去做伤天害理的事情。
This organization still maintains a strict quota-based system that drives employees to abuse others in order to protect their jobs.
其中最后就是那个我观察到一个的是关于黑诊所。
Another observation relates to the black clinics.
所谓的黑诊所，就是既未经登记注册的诊所，通过操作非法的超声波仪器来禁病胎儿的性别。
They are unregistered abortion clinics that typically have an illegal ultrasound machine that tell expecting parents the gender of the child.
正律诊所提供一系列的服务，从性别鉴定后堕胎都不需要客户提供真实的姓名身份。
These clinics offer a variety of services from gender identification to later term abortions, with all services offered on an anonymous basis.
我坚信性状可以改变，可是需要多少人受到伤害才能导致改变呢？
Now, I do believe that things will change, but how many must suffer before that happens?
我希望许多年之后，我们的后代将记住我们这一代人实实在在的做了一些事情，来改变这样的悲剧。
I hope that many years from now, our children's children will remember us as the generation that did something about this great tragedy.
因为我们这些人已经意识到正在中国发生的事情，
As we are the ones who are aware of what is happening in China.
我们有责任采取行动。
We have this responsibility to take action.
我也祈祷那一天将到来，中国的妇女的子宫不再受到强制性的控制。
I will also pray that the day will come where China will no longer coercively control women's wombs.
我相信这是现代世界历史上最大的悲剧之一。
I believe this is one of the most tragic events of modern world's history.
你能想象历史书籍即是中国政府通过一胎化和二胎化政策所扼杀的胎儿，以及所摧残的妇女的人数超过了任何的瘟疫或是2次世界大战总和所夺走的人口吗？
Can you imagine that history books revealing that the Chinese government, through their one and the two-child policies, having killed more babies and brutalized more women than such events as the plague or both world wars combined?
这样的悲剧正在发生。试问，如果我们不行动起来，谁会？如果我们不发声，谁会发声呢？
These tragedies are happening, and if we don't do something, I ask who will? If we don't say something, again, who will?
谢谢。
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Wong. Ms. Lee.
Senator Daines and members of the committee, I'm honored to be here today and to speak with you from my personal experience of China and the new two-child policy. I moved to China 7 years ago with my husband, and I was eager to learn the language and culture of this amazing land. We knew at the time that a one-child policy existed, but were unaware of the significance of it. We also knew that boys were the more desirable gender. And as time passed, we began to look around us, and we noticed on the way to school in the morning, on the backs of parents' bicycles, on the backs of grandparents' bicycles, 2 boys for every girl. We would see children exercising in the schoolyards, and we noticed the same thing. Boys in great number and much fewer girls. We began to ask questions of each other and of our friends. Where are all the girls? Where are the children with disabilities? Do these families want more than one child, or are they satisfied? As our language skills increased and as we began to make friends among locals, we learned couples were being pressured in draconian ways to manage their family size through abortions. It was hard to believe, and we didn't want to, but it was real. Despite it being illegal to tell parents the gender of an unborn baby, thousands of black market abortion clinics that Sarah referred to are enabling parents to have gender-selective abortions every day. As to the question, do they want more than one child? Hundreds of Chinese people have answered me this question personally and said, yes, I wish I could have as many children as I want, but I can't. Every single day, as I would walk the streets with my children, I would be told how lucky I was to have many children. And people would bemoan to me the fact that their government would only let them have one. We can call it a one-child policy. We can call it a two-child policy. We can call it whatever we want. But we cannot deny the reality that China's population control policy leaves men and women across the country without basic human reproductive rights and leaves millions of babies dead at the hand of anxious relatives, sold on the black market, or dead on abortion tables. As our awareness of this heartbreak grew, so did our desire to help. It started off as helping a few friends who were pregnant. We realized quickly that this was not pro-life work as we understood it in America. In America, when volunteering at U.S. pregnancy resource centers, I was taught to tell people that they had options. In China, there were no options. As we embraced our friends, our burden grew, and we, along with a small group of Chinese friends, started a coalition for the purpose of helping pregnant women who wanted to keep their babies. After starting a variety of baby-saving initiatives and enduring great hardships, we partnered with churches and nonprofit groups to form the China Life Alliance, a coalition of Chinese citizens who rescue thousands of babies each year before they are abandoned, sold, or killed. We do this through education, through safe houses, through legal aid, through financial aid, and whatever other creative solutions our team comes up with. Over the years, we have seen unimaginable horrors. This has been the greatest and most difficult cause of our life. I would like to share with you two stories before we are through of my close personal friends. Though their stories happened under what we call the one-child policy, under this new child policy, their outcome would not be changed at all. First, I want to talk to you about Ivy. Ivy was a single college student when she discovered that she was pregnant by her married professor. The consequences for Ivy when she chose to give birth to her daughter and not abort or abandon her were severe. Ivy was expelled from college, and her daughter was denied a hukou or birth certificate, which meant she could never go to school, never be treated at a hospital, or travel. Ivy is one of the most courageous women I know. Because she was a single mother, Ivy could not get a government-sanctioned job. She worked for a pittance and found under the table work to do. She had no support, and no man would marry her because under the one-child policy, he would not be able to have a child of his own with her. Her daughter is now a vivacious 16-year-old with dreams of attending Harvard, and Ivy works with the China Life Alliance, helping other women who find themselves single and pregnant. My second story is about Grace, who had a daughter born with Down syndrome. This story is felt deeply by me because I am the mother of a child with a disability. Population control puts dramatic pressure on parents of disabled children. Grace is from a minority people group, which, owing to their rural situation, is allowed to have 2 children. The pressure to have both children be healthy and male in order to earn income for the family proved to be too much for their family. When the baby was 5 days old and still receiving oxygen from a tank, her grandmother locked Grace out of the house and attempted to kill the baby by unplugging her oxygen for 8 hours. Miraculously, the baby survived, and Grace called my Chinese friend and me, and we helped them think through options and reasons to save their baby's life. Repeatedly, as we sat there with the grandparents and the parents, we heard them say, it wouldn't be a big deal if we could just have another child. But because this one imperfect child counted as part of their quota, the family economics made the choice to keep her impossible. It is challenging for me to stay composed when I share these stories. I see their tears and I feel their fears. I hold their hands and I hold their story in my heart. I want the world to see the heartbreak the population control has brought to the people of beautiful China. While we rejoice for those who will now be able to have 2 children, instead of 1, I believe we must continue to speak up for the rights of the men, women, and children whose lives are so deeply affected by this policy and the attempts to control their reproductive rights. As we ask what we can do and how we can move forward, I'd like to ask you to remember the stories of Ivy and Grace. Let us honor their courage and bring change that gives them hope.
Thanks for your testimony, Ms. Lee. Mr. Mosher.
I'd like to start by thanking the members of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China for holding this important hearing, and particularly for you, Senator Daines, for chairing it at this point. This is a hearing that's near and dear to my heart, as it was to Jennifer's, and in a sense, in almost the same way. I was at Stanford University in 1979 when China first allowed foreign researchers to come into that country. And I was the first American social scientist to live on the ground in China for a year and study rural life in China in 1979 and 1980 when the one-child policy began. And it swept across the Chinese landscape like a terrible hurricane, sweeping up pregnant women who were 3 and 6 and 9 months pregnant, telling them that their pregnancies were illegal. They'd been legal, of course, a few weeks before, but the party had now decreed otherwise, arresting them for the crime of being pregnant, taking them away from their homes and families, locking them up in holding pens where they were subjected to morning to night propaganda sessions, brainwashing sessions, we should properly call them, until they were taken by force, by coercion, under escort to a local medical center where they were aborted. In some cases, the third trimester abortions were done by cesarean section, and babies were killed at birth. I was there for this entire process, and as far as I know, I think I'm one of the only or one of the few Western eyewitnesses to the way the program is actually carried out in China, with the identification of pregnant women as criminals, with their arrest, with their imprisonment, and at the end of the day, with their forced abortion and forced sterilization. So I was there at the beginning, and I would like to say that I'm also here at the close, at the end of this barbaric policy, but unfortunately that would not be true. It is true that the Chinese Communist Party has now decided that all Chinese couples will be allowed to have a second child, or will soon be allowed once they jump through the proper legislative hoops at their rubber stamp parliament, will soon be allowed to have a second child rather than being restricted to only one child, as some are now. But foreign observers who have greeted this, the apparent end of the one-child policy with euphoria, should understand that this does not represent a new birth of reproductive freedom in China. Those who publicly commended the Chinese leadership as if they had completely decided to abolish a policy of limiting childbearing in China that's caused so much physical, emotional, and spiritual damage to the families of the nation have got it wrong, because the Chinese leadership has done no such thing. China is not backing away from draconian birth limits because Communist Party leader Xi Jinping has suddenly developed a conscience. There's no evidence that anyone in the senior leadership has ever lost any sleep over the hundreds of millions of unborn children and newborn children their policy has killed over the past 35 years since I was first in China. There's no evidence that any of them have shed a tear for the hundreds of millions of young mothers forcibly aborted and sterilized over this same period, or had a moment's regret for China's tens of millions of missing baby girls. What does keep them up at night, and what has prompted this modification of the planned birth policy, is the dawning realization that their misguided policy is crippling China's economic growth. For at least the past 2 years, China's workforce has actually been shrinking. That's a pretty amazing statistic in the most populous country in the world. Last year, the potential workforce fell by a reported 3.71 million, almost 4 million workers, a significant number even by China's standards. At the same time, the over 60 population is exploding. According to UN projections, it is expected to more than double by 2050, reaching an astonishing 437 million people over the age of retirement. China is growing old before it grows rich, and the strains on China's nascent pension programs will be enormous. And we could, Mr. Chairman, imagine a day when the Chinese government also declares that the elderly are superfluous and need to be encouraged to prematurely end their lives. That, I think, would also fall under the aegis of the population control program. There is another reason, even more fundamental, why I'm not celebrating the end of the one-child policy. Regardless of whether party leaders allow Chinese couples to have 1, 2, or even 3 children, the underlying policy has not and probably will not change. Now, Dr. Eberstadt, Reggie Littlejohn, Jennifer Lee, and Sarah Huang have all made this point. But let me just underline the fact that the underlying policy is the policy of planned birth, 计划生育 in Chinese. And under the policy of planned birth, the Chinese state, rather than the Chinese people, decide how many children are to be born in China each year. And it was none other than Chairman Mao himself, the founder of the People's Republic of China, who first put the planned birth policy in place. The great helmsman, as he was known, decided way back in the 1950s that the 5-year economic plans being drawn up by the Chinese Communist Party should control not just production, but reproduction, and they have ever since. That is why the shift to a 2-child policy is occurring as part of the next 5-year plan, approved at the latest meeting of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee. The official communique about that meeting, which was released by the Xinhua news agency on October 29, made clear that in the 13th 5-year economic plan, China's leaders had decided to ramp up both economic production and reproduction. The communique itself is written in the almost unreadable pastiche of slogans that the party resorts to on such occasions. But I translate it as, quote, promote the balanced development of the population, resolutely carry out the basic policy of planned births, thoroughly implement the policy of each couple birthing 2 children, actively begin to address the aging of the population. So the basic policy of planned births has not changed. What has changed is the state's desire to increase reproduction, and it will, by one means or another, increase reproduction. Of course, it's already too late to rebalance the population and stop the aging of the population. That's already baked into the demographic cake. And it is doubtful whether or not the new policy will have much of an impact immediately on childbearing unless the state steps in with more coercive measures. When the one-child policy has been relaxed for certain segments of the population in the past, first for rural couples, whose first child was a girl, then for all rural couples, then for urban couples where both husband and wife were only children, the results have been underwhelming. The last tweaking of the planned birth policy occurred just 2 years ago. It was particularly disappointing to party leaders hoping for a baby boomlet. The government had announced that couples in which only one spouse was an only child would be allowed 2 children, and they planned for 20 million births in the year 2014. Actually, only 16.9 million babies materialized. Babies don't materialize, of course, they're conceived, but in a material society like China, we could appropriately use that term. Out of the 11 million couples eligible to have a second child, only 1.45 million actually applied for a permit. So the response was something over 10% of the population. These figures suggest that at least among China's urban population, of course, more and more people are pouring into urban centers where economic opportunities are available. Couples are not eagerly waiting to fill the maternity wards. I think 40 years of anti-natal, anti-child propaganda has left its mark on the Chinese psyche. The Chinese Communist Party, because of 35 years of anti-people propaganda, has succeeded in largely dismantling the most family-centered culture, one of the most family-centered cultures the planet has ever seen. Few of those people who grew up under the one-child policy, who are now the second generation of people to grow up under the one-child policy. Their parents were only children, and in many cases, their grandparents were only children. They'd rather spend their limited incomes on themselves than, say, disposable diapers. So what will the Chinese leaders do if now appears likely the Chinese people do not procreate up to plan? At present, couples are permitted to have a second child, but I don't expect the matter to end there. Soon they will be encouraged, then they will be motivated, and finally one can imagine that they might one day be ordered to bear children. I could at this point quote Dr. Eberstadt quoting me, but I'll refrain from doing that. If this prediction sounds a little overwrought, consider what China has been doing to young pregnant mothers for the better part of 2 generations now. They've been visited by family planning officials, planned birth officials, who encourage them to get abortions, who then motivate them and at the end of the day ultimately take them under escort to have abortions. You could see how young pregnant mothers would be encouraged to bear children, would be subject to periodic pelvic examinations to make sure they haven't secretly gotten an abortion, and punished if they refuse to bear the children the state wants them to bear. At the outset of the one-child policy, in fact, when I was in China, then Paramount leader Deng Xiaoping ordered his officials to, quote, use whatever means you must to force the birth rate down. He went on to say, with the support of the Chinese Communist Party, you have nothing to fear. Chinese officials took him at their word, and women were rounded up en masse to be aborted, sterilized, and contracepted. Even today, these abuses continue. And they will continue, because as far as I know, Central Committee Directive Number 7 of 1983 has not been rescinded. It requires women who've had 2 children to be sterilized, as Reggie pointed out. It requires women pregnant with out-of-plan births to be aborted, which will be the fate of women who are pregnant with a 3rd child. And it requires women who've not yet been given permission to have children to be contracepted. That will stay in place. It will also continue to be the case that single women in China will not be allowed to have children, because all of their pregnancies are ipso facto out-of-plan births. So the same party officials who've been responsible for decades of forced abortions and sterilizations would have no qualms about enforcing mandatory pregnancy. If the higher birth rate called for by China's new planned birth policy cannot be achieved voluntarily, I think childbearing in China may one day become mandatory. What should China do? Well, China's leaders should, number one, abandon the planned birth policy altogether, the policy that's been in place since the 1950s. They should allow couples to freely choose the number and spacing of their children and have as many or as few as they desire. Number two, China's leaders should respect the consensus of the international community as expressed in the policy of the UN Population Fund. The UN Population Fund affirms that couples enjoy the right to reasonably decide the number and spacing of their children, something that China denies its own people. The National Health, number three, the National Health and Planned Birth Commission, created in 2013 from the merger of the Ministry of Health and National Population and Planned Birth Commission, should revert to its former role as the Ministry of Health and its planned birth arm abolished. Only if these reforms are undertaken will forced abortions and forced sterilizations, which have characterized China's planned birth policy from the beginning, come to an end. Now, is this likely to happen? Well, sadly, no. I think the totalitarian impulse that drives these policies is far too strong in China. From a more practical, political point of view, the planned birth policy employs far too many people. It generates far too much in the way of profits to corrupt officials through the fines for having illegal children. And it's too closely identified with the Chinese Communist Party to ever be lightly abandoned. The Chinese Communist Party has invested a lot of its legitimacy in the claim that it and only it knows how to manage the Chinese economy, and that reproduction is part of managing the Chinese economy. Were it to abandon the planned birth policy altogether, it would be admitting that its management has been a failure. It has, of course, been a failure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. I first want to admit for the record Senator Rubio's comments, who is the co-chair of this committee, so ordered. Let me start off as someone who spent 5.5 years in China, living there back in the 90s. I was in the private sector at the time, expatriate, working for a Fortune 20 company. We were based in Guangzhou, but traveled extensively around the country. So I've certainly had a chance to witness both the positive as well as some of the concerning developments of the region. I remember having a set of twin baby girls dropped off at our doorstep one morning when my wife called me at work from a desperate mother in a rural area. And they turned to an American family for help. And I can tell you, through a long, arduous process of 2 little baby girls are now 2 thriving teenagers here living in the United States, adopted by a family. I remember working with one of my employees whose wife had become pregnant without permission in dealing with the family planning police, but successfully resolving it to protect that little baby girl that they now have. And Ms. Lee, I do remember, too, the days of when we had 2 children and we moved over there. We had 2 more born in Hong Kong, and so we were a very lucky family with 4 children. And the comments we, too, would have quietly with Chinese families who were yearning that they could have perhaps more than 1 child as well. So this is more than just a hearing for me. This is also an experience that we had as a family and something I care very, very deeply about. There was a quote in Ms. Huang's written testimony that said, she was quoting the famous William Wilberforce, and I quote her testimony as she quoted Wilberforce when he said, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know." Mr. Eberstadt, according to the Commission's annual report, the initial relaxation of the one-child policy that allowed couples to have 2 children if one of the parents was an only child only resulted in about 1/4 of the estimated increase in births that was expected. What reason, if any, is there to believe that a 2-child policy will result in a different outcome and have a significant impact on the demographic crisis currently facing China?
Senator, I think you've put your finger exactly on the question that Chinese authorities must be thinking about today. For us social scientists who are interested in looking at evidence and empirical results rather than government ideology, I think we'd have to say that the chances that this will have a substantially different impact from the earlier tinkering, slight recalibration, would be very, very small. And the reason for this is that the best single predictor that we have as social scientists for fertility outcomes under voluntary family planning is the desire of parents. If we look all around the world, the best single indicator, better than income, better than education, better than urbanization or infant mortality or access to contraceptives, the best single indicator is desired family size. And if this slight recalibration does absolutely nothing to change desired family size, as we would expect it would not, I think we would have to presume that the impact will be minimal. As Stephen Mosher has already mentioned, China's demographic trends for the next generation are basically already baked into the cake.
Why don't you think they would perhaps then rethink and abolish any restrictions on children at all in terms of numbers?
You know, my demographer friends in China wonder about that also. As I reflect upon it, my own hypothesis would be that the Chinese government doesn't want to relinquish this instrument of social control precisely because it is an instrument of social control. It may not have the demographic power to result in the sorts of demographic impacts that population planners would like, but it's still a very powerful tool of social control, along with some other very powerful tools of social control that the government wishes to maintain.
Thank you. Ms. Littlejohn, do you want to add to that response? I have a question for you as well.
Yes, Senator. Your question, why doesn't China completely abandon all coercive population control, given the fact that they have backed themselves into a horrific demographic disaster in terms of the gender imbalance and the old and young population imbalance? That was actually the subject of my entire testimony on April 30th of 2015. And the fact that it makes no demographic sense whatsoever for China to continue the one-child policy begs the question of why are they continuing it? And in my opinion, the one-child policy started in the 1979-1980 timeframe when under Chairman Mao had said people are the strength of China, and he was encouraging women to have more children. The average fertility rate at that time was about 6 kids per woman, and now under the one-child policy, it's gone down to maybe 1.3 to 1.6 kids per woman, depending on who you ask. And that enormous population explosion under the Mao era is now heading towards retirement. I believe that in the beginning, when Deng Xiaoping instituted the one-child policy, that population control was the point of the policy, and the terror of forced abortion was a byproduct. I believe now that the reason that it makes no sense to continue the one-child policy is that terror has now become the purpose of the policy. And the Chinese Communist Party is a brutal totalitarian regime, and they're using the one-child policy literally to terrorize people through forced abortion, which is a form of torture.
Let me ask a question about on gendercide. Do you believe the two-child policy will reduce gendercide?
No. And the reason I believe that is because of the sterilization problem. So, right now, in our area of the countryside, and also as Steve Mosher has mentioned, if a person has had a second child, they will be sterilized. So if a woman has had a son, then she may very well opt not to have that second child because she doesn't want to become sterilized, which will disable her. And then, so that girl will not be born. That family has a boy, and then the second child will not be born. Then in terms of people who have a girl first, right now in the countryside, there is a two-child policy for people whose first child is a girl that can have a second child, but people generally regard that as being their last chance to have a boy, and they selectively abort and selectively abandon those second daughters, and that will still happen under a two-child policy. So I really do not expect the numbers to change much, if at all, of gendercide under the two-child policy.
Thank you. My House colleagues have now returned from the battle on the floor, and so thank you for the opportunity to chair temporarily here. I'll turn it back to Chairman Smith.
Thank you so much, Senator Daines, and thank you for your insights and your leadership on these issues.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'd like to yield to Commissioner Pittenger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you again for your testimony today and how heart-rendering it is to us to see your real commitment in these life-saving measures. Ms. Lee, I would just like to ask you, without suffering through details, describe to me the experience of a pregnant woman coming to you, seeking help, and the pressures that she's receiving from family and from the government. And how do you deal with these requests? And just to give us a more personal view of this.
Okay, that's an excellent question. The China Life Alliance is, as I mentioned before, almost all Chinese citizens. So typically, I will not interact with a desperate mother in the first stage of our contact. Usually, she will speak to someone, like I mentioned, Ivy, or possibly one of the other women that works with us. And they'll usually establish a meeting right off the bat. And it's actually very complex because this issue is so fraught with political danger. We use technology to avoid, being tracked. Most of the workers use multiple telephones and multiple ways of communicating, and that's how they set up their initial contact with desperate parents. Would you like more?
Well, just the pressures that she's under, and just
a lot of the pressure. Actually, when someone is being pressured to undergo a forced abortion, it's actually oftentimes the pressure from family or from your employer that will prove to be too much for a person. A lot of women, they may be told that they need to have an abortion, but they won't go through with it until their employer begins to threaten them. Oftentimes, a male employer will tell them, unless you show me the scans, unless you show me proof of your IUD, these different kinds of things, I'll fire you. And oftentimes, their home loans or their rental contracts are connected with their job. And what a lot of these women we deal with face is losing not just their job, but their home, oftentimes their car. Many different aspects of their life are challenged.
Thank you. Ms. Wang, I guess she can hear me. What about women like yourself who are pregnant with a second child before this policy has been fully implemented? Is there any sense of the government as being more lenient with you and with other women during this transition phase? You want the interpreter? Could you speak louder, please?
Turn on the mic.
就是二胎制，你认为二胎化的政策比一胎化政策是不是更宽松？
是的，
更对人更那个不是
Very good.
是的。
I believe so.
Okay, Mr. Mosier, despite the looming demographic crisis and calls for demographic experts to scrap the one-child policy, the Chinese government has instead chosen to make incremental changes over the years. What do you think the rationale is, and how do you abolish this entirely? Perhaps you spoke to this some, but I wasn't in the room.
The underlying rationale is that the party has the right, under a decision made by Chairman Mao Zedong back in the early 1950s when this was under debate in the top upper reaches of the Chinese Communist Party. The party has the right and the authority to control reproduction under a state plan in the same way that it controls production. So that in the same way the 5-year plan, which is passed in general terms by the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party and then operationalized and concretized at various levels of the government by the different ministries. In the same way that plan will detail how many tons of steel or how many kilowatts of energy that are to be produced in China. It will also specify how many children are to be reproduced in China. This has been part and parcel of economic planning in China since almost the very beginning. So for the Chinese Communist Party to abandon this now would be, first and foremost, an admission that perhaps to the Chinese people that it had no right in the first place to seize authority over this area. Secondly, it would be a tacit admission that it had gotten it wrong in imposing a one-child policy, which is now, playing out to the detriment of economic advances in China and of course, has resulted in the destruction of the family. And since the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy is very closely tied up to its most important policies, of which planned birth is one, it will not lightly abandon this policy because it might very well call its legitimacy into question in the eyes of the Chinese people. So I do not see them relinquishing control over reproduction. I do not see that as very likely at all. It would take a fundamental transformation, I think, of the political system in China.
Is there anything we can do in U.S. policy to encourage this transition of this coercive policy? And what do you encourage Chinese families to do to value their own, Chinese people to value baby girls as much?
Well, I've traveled in China extensively. I've visited villages where there are many, many large families, families where there are equal numbers of little boys and little girls. Those villages are Christian villages, are Catholic villages, where there has been missionary effort made in China since the Ming Dynasty hundreds of years ago, and where they, in solidarity, protect their women from the extortions and from the coercion of the planned birth police. In most of China, of course, that kind of situation is not to be found. We can certainly encourage the Chinese government to respect human rights, to respect international norms when it comes to the basic right of families to decide for themselves the number and spacing of their children. And we have been Well, I've been involved in this fight for 35 years, since I was present when the one-child policy began in China. I take any relaxation of the policy as a step in the right direction, but the underlying problem, the problem that will not easily go away, is the problem of the planned birth policy itself, that the state has decreed that it, not Chinese couples, not Chinese individuals, have the right to determine how many children will be born in the country.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pitts?
Just here to listen,
Thank you. I'll just, I know many of the questions have been already asked, but just a couple of questions that I would like to point out. To Sarah, if I could ask you, and maybe others might want to respond to it. You've said that a Chinese mother's womb is one of the most dangerous places to be, and most don't get out alive. You point out that when you add up the numbers, the number of murdered children, including and especially murdered girl children, is more than both world wars combined, which is, you know, an astonishing. If a foreign power were to impose upon the Chinese population this kind of brutality and carnage, you can be sure that the Chinese government would respond and defend its people. And yet, in this case, it's the perpetrator of those crimes against humanity. It's bizarre, and it certainly is a gross violation of human rights, to say the least. You also point out, and some of you have mentioned, you know, the black clinics where ultrasounds are used. Do you sense any sense on the part of the Chinese government's part to rein in on the use of ultrasound imaging to determine the gender of the child, which is really a search and destroy mission, as we know? Have there been prosecutions? I mean, having been at this not as long as Stephen Mosher, although he inspired all of our work on this from the very beginning, there's always the apologists who say things have changed. I'll never forget a hearing that friends on the other side of the aisle held in the Foreign Affairs Committee in 1985, and I was like the lone voice objecting that there was a great deal of hyperbole, that it was all over. The high tides were over. 83 was the big and bad year, and China had learned its lessons. And we had even a Foreign Service officer who said he traveled the length and breadth of China, figuratively, not literally, and he was reporting that all is well. And I find that astonishing that time and time again, people are ready to put a gloss on this and say things are fine. But specifically, prosecutions against these black clinics, does China yet get it, that they have become the magnet for sex trafficking because of the dearth of women brought about in part because of the forced abortion policy and the one-child overlay of all of that? If any of you would want to respond to that, I'd appreciate it. Yes, Ms. Lee.
So I've personally been to those black clinics multiple times. I've gone with my husband and I've gone with Chinese friends, and I've asked questions. I've told them I was pregnant, asked how much it would cost to get an abortion. Also, our Chinese friends do that, whether we're with them or not. And there's no fear on the part of any operator of a black abortion clinic that we've been to. They actually brag about their relationships with the government, with police officers. They tell us how many abortions they've performed for members of government party. Yeah, no fear at all. I've never heard of one being prosecuted or in any way.
On the issue of women's emotional health, I think one of the greatest overlooked areas here, not by you, but by the international community, is the post-traumatic stress, the horrific consequences of the one-child per couple policy on women's psychological health. On one of my many trips to China, I remember meeting with state family planning officials, and the New York Times had just recently done a page-one story about a woman who was clinically depressed because of the forced abortion she had been compelled to undergo. And when I brought that, and I had the newspaper with me, intact, the whole paper, I said, how do you respond to that? And they said, it's a big lie. The New York Times is making it all up. There's no consequences to this. When a member of the People's Congress was here leading a delegation, Madam Fu, I asked her about the 600 women purportedly who commit suicide every day, And, a number of those, probably a large number, are attributable to the population control program. And raised all of this with her. She says it was a lie. This was over at the Foreign Affairs Committee where we had this exchange. Said I was making up the statistics, so I said, well, they're your statistics from the Beijing Centers for Disease Control, which seeks to parallel, I think, a lot of what our CDC does, and abruptly ended the meeting after she got the documentation, which was first contained in the Country Reports on Human Rights Practices, the China report put out by U.S. Department of State. I think this unrecognized psychological impact needs to be highlighted. Any of you would want to speak to what this is doing to the Chinese women in particular? Yes, Dr. Moser.
When the policy began shortly after the policy began in 1980, there were suicides in the part of China where I lived. Suicides committed by young women who had been forced to have an abortion. So it was clear to me from the outset that there was a direct correlation, a one-to-one relationship between the forced abortion of young mothers who had conceived their children in love in intact marriages and were looking forward to their birth in a few weeks or months, and their inability to protect the child they were carrying. And you think it's not their fault. They were taken under duress. They were coerced into the forced abortion. But a mother, and the mothers here will acknowledge this is true, the mothers blame themselves anyway for their failure not to protect their unborn children. One of the striking things about the suicide statistics out of China, you've already mentioned them in part, is that in every other country of the world, more men than women commit suicide. Yeah. In every other country of the world, it's the elderly, middle-aged and elderly who predominantly end their lives. In China, it's precisely the opposite. It's young women. And it's young women because that is the precise demographic that is being targeted for forced abortion and forced sterilization. And the forced sterilization, I would add, just adds another layer of guilt and anger to the whole process, because what it does is it prevents a woman ever from having a make-up child, a child to make up for the child that she lost.
Yes, Dr. Epstein.
Chairman Smith, if it's all right, I'd like to return for a moment to the question of sex-selective abortion. I was just reflecting on your question there. I think we have to say that there are two and only two sure ways of eliminating sex-selective abortion anywhere. One way is to eliminate the availability of prenatal gender determination technology. The other way is to eliminate the availability of abortion.
Hi, Ms. Huang would like to respond to the question regarding the Black Clinic.
去年我曾带一个美国记者进入了这样的一个诊所，当看到地板上的斑斑血迹以及实施堕胎手术的蜜时，他恶心的要吐。
Last year, I took an American reporter into one of these clinics who became sick to her stomach as she witnessed the floor stained in blood and the back room where forced abortions were performed.
不幸的是，这类诊所生意兴旺，聘满中国的各个城市。要找到这样的诊所并不难。
Unfortunately, these clinics are very busy and exist in almost every city in China. They are not hard to find.
最近我和中国生命联盟合作，帮他们绘制这类诊治的分布图，以便研究小队开展反制堕胎的研究活动。
I recently began working with China Life Alliance to map all of these clinics so abortion rescue teams could attempt to rescues.
可惜我们不得不取消这项计划，因为这类诊所实在太多了。
Unfortunately, we had to cancel the project because there were way too many to count.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask anyone who would like to take it. Maybe Dr. Eberstadt, you might want to take the first shot at it. And that is the numbers. I mean, there was a Human Rights report, State Department report, that suggested there were 100 million missing girls, and that was 15 years ago. you know, obviously it's a closed society, and even the demographers probably operate with a certain amount of restraint because of government pleasure or displeasure. And Mira Wiesenstahl, who has testified before our committee, has pointed out that in Asia, there's 160 plus million missing females. And that includes India, of course, and some other countries where there's a tremendous amount of gendercide occurring, sex selection, abortion in particular, to lead to that gendercide. But we never really can get a handle on how many missing girls are there really. And it really becomes, it's important because we want to be accurate, but it is a closed society, and they guard statistics very, I mean, we know it even with economic data, that you can be tried and prosecuted and jailed if you put out, information that's contrary to the government line. So I'm just wondering if there's any estimate that is based on the best available science that you can convey to the Commission.
Chairman Smith, I can tell you a little bit about my own homework. There are other people who have done their homework and come up with somewhat different numbers. Nobody, I think, would say that the number of missing girls in the era of the one-child policy in China would be less than tens and tens of millions. The exact number is somewhat difficult to calculate precisely because of the incentives for hiding children in China. If one looks at successive population censuses in the People's Republic of China, you see something that you don't find regularly elsewhere in the world, which is with each successive population count, more people show up. More children or adolescents get counted. And that's not because there's a lot of in-migration from abroad, and it's not because people are coming back to life. Ordinarily, you would expect fewer from one census to the next with very little migration or even out-migration. So the incentives today certainly are for hiding girls, also hiding boys, and that makes it a little bit difficult to tell just what the numbers are. The United Nations Population Division, which I think has got very good researchers working there. The U.S. Census Bureau, likewise excellent researchers working there, come up with slightly different estimates of how many should be counted. But that's based upon a certain inference they have to make, since undercounting is accepted as being the reality today.
Is there a number that you would?
I would have to go back and take a look at my own writings, and I'll be very happy to send that that along.
And we'll make that a part of the record.
Tens of millions.
Thank you. Let me. What do you think our next steps ought to be? I'm today sending another letter to the president, asking him to enforce the visa ban. I've been involved with several visa ban pieces of legislation. I wrote the Belarus Democracy Act, which has been well implemented by both the Bush and now the Obama administrations, that focuses on the dictatorship of Lukashenko in Belarus. The Magnitsky Act has had a mixed implementation, and that was a totally bipartisan effort that obviously focuses on Russia, and I'm the prime sponsor of the global Magnitsky, which is pending, has not passed yet. But this legislation goes, the Admiral Nance Meg Donovan Foreign Relations Act of 2000, and specifically a provision of that, which I put in, makes clear that anyone who is complicit in forced abortion or forced sterilization is inadmissible to the United States. And yet, we asked the Congressional Research Service to look at this, and less than 30 people, and I would fault the Bush administration on this as well, they did not aggressively at all implement it, even though they were asked to. But the Obama administration has turned a blind eye. I've asked at hearings, what are you doing? Who knows if we'll ever get an answer back to this. What would be your recommendation? You see, we've got a policy that is law that can hold people to account for to the extent that we can do it, at least deny them access to the United States. We have not done it. What would be your thoughts on, or your message to the administration on that, or anything else it ought to be doing right now? If they really care about the women who have been victimized, the families, the men, because they're victimized as well, but mostly the women, obviously, who bear the scars disproportionately to everyone else, and then all the dead babies. Stephen?
If I might respond to that, Mr. Chairman, I would point to the very effective move to identify a half a dozen military officers who were involved through military-related enterprises in China in cyber attacks on the United States. And the level of cyber attacks is apparently receding now, in part, I think, in response to that. I don't think we would have to identify all 1 million of the population control police in China. I think if we identified a half a dozen senior officials who were involved in implementing the policy, that would send a very strong message and would get a reaction immediately in terms of decreasing the level of coercion in China. If they were,
idea, yeah.
if Chinese officials were aware that they would not be welcome in the United States, that they would not be able to invest in the United States or visit their children who are studying here at American universities or looking over their American investments in real estate, as easily, that would set them back on their heels.
Yes, Ms. Littlejohn.
Chairman Smith, I know that you've been leading the fight to defund the UNFPA on the basis of the Camp Caston violation, involvement with coercive population control, the emphasis being the forced abortion aspect of this. But in part of the testimony that I was giving while you were out of the room, I wanted to convey to you that in our villages, something that is really impacting gendercide is the forced sterilization aspect of this. And the thing about the sterilization is everyone agrees that forced sterilization is a crime against humanity. People have various issues about abortion. They might not want to touch that topic, even if it's forced abortion. Forced sterilization, everybody agrees on. And it's the forced sterilization that is really, it really hampers women having girls, because if a woman has a boy first in the village, she's going to stop having kids. She doesn't want to have that second child because she has to be sterilized after the second child. So then the chance for the girl to be born on that second child doesn't happen because of the sterilization. And then at the same time, with in the countryside where even now, if your first child is a girl, you can have a second child. Because of the forced sterilization, women are aborting those second daughters because they want to save that second child place for a boy. And so it's the sterilization after the second child that is, I think, a huge part of keeping gendercide in place.
Excellent point. For the record, the Camp Caston language says that we will not support any organization that supports or co-manages a coercive population control program. So it is indeed inclusive of involuntary sterilization, but I think your point as to how this is leading to gendercide needs to be emphasized, and I think that was an excellent point. Thank you. Anything else you would like to add before we conclude? I want to thank you so much for your testimonies. Again, both other House commissioners and I deeply regret we missed some of it because of the voting that occurred on the floor, 7 votes, but I've read your testimonies. They were excellent, very insightful, full of information, and I think, Dr. Mosier, your suggestion that we compile a list of people, and any help any of you could provide to us, to the commission, because we'll convey that list to the administration and also do our own due diligence to try to put a list together. I think it's a great idea. You don't have to get all 1 million family planning cadres or whatever that number is these days. Focus on the leadership. And so thank you for that idea. Without, I guess there's no other comments. The hearing is adjourned, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
you.